Welcome everybody to the Tippie webinar series. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Ashley Durham and I am the Director of Alumni Engagement at the Tippie College of Business. The Tippie webinar series is an initiative of the Alumni Relations Department, and our goal is to bring the knowledge of our faculty and staff to you wherever you may be in the world. Today, Jennifer Nahrgang, a professor in the Management and Entrepreneurship Department at Tippie, is sharing her presentation, Working Apart but Together, How to Design and Coach Hybrid Teams for Peak Performance. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. I'll bring them up during the Q&A session at the end of Jennifer's presentation. And as a reminder, all of our virtual presentations are uploaded to the college's YouTube page with closed captions a few days following the live webinar event. Finally, you are encouraged to stay until the end of the webinar so that we can gather your thoughts on today's presentation. Your feedback helps us make our virtual programs better, so we appreciate you taking time to answer our survey at the end of the Q&A. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Nahrgang. Jennifer is the Palmer Professor of Management and Entrepreneurship at the University of Iowa. She's an award-winning researcher whose findings make headlines everywhere from Eastern Iowa TV to the Harvard Business Review. She joined the Tippie faculty in 2020 from Arizona State University. Before her career in academia, Jennifer spent 5 years working for the ExxonMobil Corporation. And at Tippie, she currently teaches topics related to leadership, team development, and negotiations in the Executive MBA program and numerous executive education programs. Jennifer has worked with clients such as Mayo Clinic, PayPal, Blue Cross Blue Shield, H&I corporations, and numerous small businesses. Jennifer enjoys working with students, executives, and organizations to help them discover ways of developing their talent to effectively lead today and in the future of work. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today, Jennifer, and I will hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. And thank you to everyone who's joining us. It looks like we have about 160, which is fantastic. Really appreciate you taking time to talk with us and join us today. So as Ashley mentioned, I'm going to talk today about kind of hybrid work teams. And I will say that I come at this from two different angles. One is a large majority of my research has been in teams and team dynamics and team performance. And so I kind of draw on those experiences as well. And then most recently, the University of Iowa has done a return to work, and where people have taken on different alternative work arrangements, some of which are fully remote, some of which are hybrid. And we also did a research study on that. And so we have some findings from that, just from my own research of looking at kind of how that's worked and maybe some of the things that we need to pay attention to as supervisors or as employees in kind of this hybrid team environment. So one of the things that I think is interesting as I was continuing to prepare for this is I was looking at kind of different headlines, and I came across this headline where it was basically, are we back to the Stone Age? A new organization CEO bans working from home. And basically one of the quotes from this CEO was, to become the absolute best place to work, communication and collaboration are important. And so we need to be working side by side, and that's why it's critical that we're all present in our offices. And if I were to ask you to guess who it was that said this, my guess is that most of you would say it has to be Elon Musk. He has been in the news recently, especially when he was going to take over Twitter, as saying that everybody would be back in the offices. And when someone said, well, what if they don't want to work in an office, his reply back was that they should pretend to work somewhere else. But what's interesting is that the headline that I just shared with you did not come from Elon Musk, but it actually came from Marissa Mayer, who was the Yahoo CEO. And it comes back all the way back in February of 2013 is when she was quoted as saying this. And here's kind of the full quote where she talks about, some of the best discussions occur in the hallway, meeting new people, impromptu team meetings. And so as Yahoo, we need to be physically together. And I share this with you not because I necessarily agree with either Elon Musk or CEO Mayer's views on remote work, but I share this with you because it's clearly something we've struggled with for quite some time, right? So 9 years, 7 years prior to the pandemic, there were organizations that were struggling with remote work, that were struggling with how do we lead hybrid teams and those type of things. And if you look back in the history, I think what's interesting is telecommuting or remote work actually started, not surprisingly enough, entered the public sector, or kind of we started talking about telecommuting at the time is what we called it in the 1970s. And it was coined by an engineer at NASA. And basically it started because the US government was looking for ways because of the oil crisis and the spike in gas prices, something we're dealing with today, as a way that people could work remotely and alleviate traffic problems, reduce energy consumption. So we've been dealing with it from the 1970s. Obviously, even in 2013, there were CEOs saying, how do we handle, kind of this working together, communication, collaboration within kind of these remote environments? And so we continue to struggle with that today. And so it's not anything new necessarily, but something that we struggle with, and I think obviously probably will continue to struggle with. So hopefully we can give you some tips. So, the question becomes, we know a lot about, in managing teams and employees, and the question becomes, well, how does remote work change those things that we in terms of how we manage teams and employees? And I think one of the things, so to give you kind of a couple of snapshots of what the research would say, the first is, well, how does remote work impact teams? And so here's what we know from the team's research. The first is that performance of remote or even hybrid teams can be equal to face-to-face teams if they adjust to the technology. So obviously, I think our technological advances have become, have come a long way since the 1970s and even since 2013. And you think about how much more comfortable people feel with technology. And so, that's one of the key indicators of performance, is how well do they adjust to that. The second is that we know from remote teams and hybrid teams that they're really good at idea generation, but they perform poorly on decision-making tasks. So if you're trying to make a decision as a hybrid team or a remote team, it may take quite a bit longer, especially just in terms of the speed of decision-making. The other is we know clearly that trust is essential, just like it is in any team, but it's really influenced by communication and timely responses. So if you think about remote and hybrid teams, and you think about when some coworker or team member is not getting back to you and not in a timely manner, that can be especially frustrating, because I can't just walk down the hall, right, and ask the question. And so that's really key to building trust. And then finally, what we know is that they do need occasional face-to-face meetings. Most of it would say, especially in the beginning, to kind of establish those working relationships. I know a lot of organizations are obviously also thinking about, on a week-to-week basis, can we get people together? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's what we know about kind of remote work teams and hybrid teams as well, in terms of kind of the research. The other piece is there's been research in terms of how about to the individual employee. And I will say, in our own study here in the return to work at the University of Iowa and here at Tippie, we found some of these same impacts and advantages and challenges as well. So the first is that remote work tends to increase job satisfaction. Those in remote or even hybrid kind of working arrangements tend to have higher job satisfaction. But there is a caution here, and we'll talk about it at the end, is that they can experience professional isolation. And so that's something that we need to think about in terms of how do we, maintain working relationships. The other is that, there's a lot that would say, well, I don't know if people can be as productive remotely, but actually the research would say that they can, employees can maintain high levels of productivity. That's both supervisor rated and objective performance. And so again, some of that's a little difficult sometimes to measure. And certainly there's probably some of you that would say, I'm not really, I'm not measuring, how much of an output someone has. It's more of a subjective measure. But still, the research would say that they can maintain high levels of productivity. The other is that tends to create kind of this glue in terms of stronger organizational commitment, less desire to leave an organization. Again, that's probably one of the things you have to deal with is that professional isolation. And so making sure that people still feel connected is important. And then finally, the last thing I'll say is that, in terms of, for those of you that are supervisors out there managing remote teams, supervisors really matter. And not surprisingly, right? We know that even in face-to-face work, but we do find that the highest levels of commitment, the highest levels of job satisfaction, performance with employees all come when they have this high quality relationship with their supervisor. And oftentimes they work more with their supervisor in a remote environment than they do with coworkers or lean on them more. And so you are a very important piece to kind of remote work. The other, what I want to talk today is how do you make just more teams more effective? And when I teach about teams, I typically think about it in terms of this framework. The first is when I think about teams, I think about how well are they performing? How are the members of the team satisfied? And then the viability of the team, which means is this a team that will continue to learn, grow, develop together, and continue to want to work together? And I always use the example of the first Macintosh team at Apple, because if you look into that team and you read about it, obviously very high performance, right? They created something very creative, very a technology that really transformed things, but yet they disbanded very quickly. They didn't stay together, had very low viability. There was a lot of conflict. I think most team members would say, I'm not really satisfied to be a member of this team. And so, all of those things come into play when we think about making teams more effective. And I would say it's the same thing if you think about the individuals within those teams is we want them to perform well, we want them to be satisfied, and we want them to stick around, right? And so how do we do that? And so we typically think about this as what can a supervisor do in terms of managing the team? That can be both in how you design the team as well as how you coach the team. And then it can also be in terms of the managing the boundaries. I'm not going to focus a lot on the managing the boundaries. That's basically if your team is working with other teams across organizations or within your organization with another team, those are kind of the boundaries that you need to manage. Equally important, but we're not going to spend a lot of time today, if any, on talking about kind of managing those boundaries. We're really going to focus on design the team and coach the team. And what I will say is that, usually at this point, I ask the question, what do you think is more important, design or coaching? And I get a variety of answers for a lot of different reasons. Most typical is that, well, I don't get to design my team. I don't get to choose who's on my team. But designing the team, as we'll talk about, is more than just who's on the team and picking the members of the team. There's a lot of things that you can do. And especially as we go and we rethink about people's work arrangements, we really are redesigning their jobs, right? And so that's a piece that we need to think about. And then also thinking about coaching. And typically, for a team to be very self-managing, they need to be designed well. And so I always think about it as you can't outrun a bad diet. And so you can't outcoach a poorly designed team. And so it's really important to kind of design the team effectively. So today, how I'm going to structure this is, in terms of focusing on the designing and the coaching of hybrid teams or remote teams, I want to talk about kind of what are the consistent features, what's not changing, right, about these teams. I'll also talk about kind of some of the advantages that you can leverage. And then more importantly, we'll dive into some of the challenges that you need to manage. And a lot of that, again, is based on kind of what we know from the research, as well as our own current research of kind of managing hybrid work arrangements. So let's start with design the team. So in terms of designing the team, I think one of the things that is always consistent with any team is we need to make sure that as a supervisor or as an employee and team member of the team, that we understand the clear and compelling direction of the team. What are we here for? What are we trying to accomplish? And again, you can say, well, that seems obvious, but a lot of times we don't take the time to kind of reset and think about what is the direction that we're going in, and kind of what's our overarching goals for the team, and what are we trying to accomplish. And so it's always important, whether you're in a remote or a face-to-face environment, to make sure that every team member understands kind of what that direction is. The other thing that we know, obviously, from designing a team and what's helpful in a remote or hybrid work environment is there's a lot of advantages. The first is you can really reach out and have a lot of diversity in knowledge, skills, and abilities, right? You're not limited to a certain geographic area. The talent management is really worldwide. And that's obviously why a lot of organizations use remote teams or hybrid teams, is because they can leverage kind of that diversity and knowledge, skills, and abilities. The other is that you can really match the role to the work arrangement. And I'll talk about that in terms of one of the things that we have found is that you can think about, again, if the role can be hybrid or can be remote, then and there's a good match there, then that's really helpful in terms of leveraging that and having that ability or that flexibility for that individual employee. And then the last other advantage that we know is you can really flex time across roles. And so what we found, one of the examples of in the university is that, advising appointments, again, something in terms of matching the role to the work arrangement. We used to think advising appointments or even office hours with faculty could only be done in person, but what we find is that college students actually show up more in person, and so, or online, and so they'll schedule something on Zoom to meet with their advisor, to meet with their faculty member. And so, that's matching the role to the work arrangement, but it's also giving flex time, right, where you can expand those hours across those roles as well. And so a lot of advantages for organizations. That's why a lot of organizations, again, use remote teams, because worldwide we can kind of follow the sun, right? And that there's always a team member that can continue to work and make progress on the team or towards the goal. But there's also a lot of challenges, right? And so we need to think about those challenges to manage. And so we're going to talk about three things: the interdependence between roles, redistribution of work, and then the fairness in the work arrangements. And so I'm going to dive into those kind of more specifically. The first is the interdependence between roles. And so when we think about interdependence on teams, the main thing to kind of take away from this is it's not about reporting relationships. So it's not about supervisors and who reports to certain people, but it's really about the workflow between the team members. So who is exchanging information, who needs resources from different people, who needs feedback from other members of their team in order to perform their work. So what's the workflow within the team? And so, I've X'd out kind of the org chart since it's not about reporting relationships. And I've given you two examples. And these are very simplistic examples, especially the first one over here on the left, where you've got team member 1 who basically passes information to team member 2, who then goes to team member 3, and then to team member 4, right? So kind of a chain. You can think of that as kind of a potentially an assembly line type interdependence. But probably what's more common is over here on the bottom right, where different team members are exchanging information and workflow between themselves. And so you can see here team member 1 and 2 exchange information back and forth. So do 1 and 3. But everybody's giving information into team member 4. And so that's kind of the level of interdependence. And so it's helpful to chart the workflow. And so I've given you kind of this diagram here, but it may also be helpful just from a practical standpoint to think about your group and your team members in terms of the different team members, who's sending workflow to other team members and who's receiving workflow from other team members. And again, you can see here that team member 1 actually sends a lot of different workflow to different people. And then team member 4 is also receiving a lot of workflow. And why is this important? Well, I think it's important to think about where hybrid work or remote work challenges that workflow or helps that workflow. So again, in terms of helping workflow, it may be that one of these team members is in a different time zone and they work ahead of time, and then they can pass off kind of their work to someone else in another time zone, and again, they get to kind of pick up that work and work on it. But it also can be challenging in the fact that, again, if someone is hybrid, I can't just walk down the hall to ask them a question. I need to know how to get a hold of them. I need to, help have them be just as responsive as if they were in the office. And so that can also challenge workflow. And so I think that, it's important to think about kind of where people are interdependent, and do they have similar kind of work arrangements, or is there going to be, someone's working remotely and they may work different hours than someone who's in the office. All of those type of things, I think, are things to think about, as well as to think about, are there particular work days, projects, months in which team members are more interdependent? So if I think about my own experience at ExxonMobil, I was actually in the controller's department, so background in accounting. And obviously we had to close the books, right? And so there were key work days when we were very interdependent. And you think about workflow, and I was an earnings analyst. And so obviously revenues and expenses go into earnings. And I had an expense analyst who liked to start his day later than everyone else. And so I was very dependent on him. His workflow came to me. And so it wasn't until he could kind of tell me what was happening on the expense front that I could really help to explain the earnings of the company as well. And so it was really challenging. If he was going to start his day later, that just meant that I had a later day as well. And so that's just an example kind of interdependence. And so some things to think about in terms of, as you're thinking about different work arrangements and how they impact the workflow. The other piece that I think is important to think about is kind of the work distribution, and again, that fit between the work arrangements. And here's kind of what we know from some research that we've done here at the University of Iowa is some of the contributing factors to people's intention to turn over, which basically is a simple question of, do you intend to leave this organization, right? And not surprisingly, intentions to turn over or leave the organization, or to say, I intend to leave this organization, are one of the strongest predictors that they actually will leave the organization. And what we found is that some of the contributing factors is what increased someone's kind of intent to turn over or wanting to leave the organization is if they felt like there was work redistribution due to another team member's work arrangement. So maybe someone, we all have different work arrangements, and now that workflow has changed and I have more work than what I think someone else has. And so that really contributes to turnover intentions. But alternatively, what we also found is that if someone thought that there was a perceived fit between their work arrangement and their job, then that tended to decrease their intent to turn over. So again, as you think about the advantages to leverage, if you can think about the role that people are in, the type of job that they're in, is there a good fit? So it's not necessarily about people. Are they a good fit for a remote and work environment? But is their role and their job, their task responsibilities important? Or do those are those part of a piece of, is that a good fit with their job and their work arrangement? The last piece that I'll talk about in terms of the challenges is kind of perceptions of fairness. And so there's a lot of different perceptions of fairness that we can think about. Obviously, what typically comes to mind is to think about the distributive kind of fairness. So are the outcomes consistent with the norms of allocation? We often think about that as, did I get what I thought that I deserved, right? But there's other perceptions of fairness as well. There's procedural effective fairness. So did I have a voice in the decision-making process? And do I think that the process was fair and adhered to a fair process? As a supervisor, you also have, and as an organization, you also have informational fairness. So do I explain the procedures thoroughly? Do I have candid and timely communication? And then interpersonal, am I treated or am I treating other people with dignity and respect when I'm implementing these procedures? And, a lot of times I think when we think about going into the different work arrangements, whether someone gets remote work or hybrid work or face-to-face work, we think, well, all they care about is distributive justice, right? Did I get the outcome that I wanted, although that's not necessarily distributive justice. It's more that the outcomes are consistent, right? So everybody in the same role that's doing the same type of job had the ability to kind of have the same work arrangement. But more importantly, what we found is that all of them contribute. It's not just distributive justice, right? And so these kind of correlations here, the higher means the more impact that they had on turnover intentions. But the overall takeaway here is that the extent to which people felt that there was fairness in alternative work arrangements, the less likely they were to turn over or have the intent to turn over. And so again, all of those mattered. So it's not just about kind of the outcome that they received, but also kind of the procedural fairness. What does that mean? It means that everybody got to apply for a alternative work arrangement, and we thought the procedure was fair. If I didn't get my work arrangement, or if I did get my work arrangement, was it explained to me in a candid way? Was the information provided to everyone? And interpersonally, was I treated with dignity and respect? All of those contribute to reducing turnover intention. So really important to think about in terms of kind of those aspects as you think about designing different work arrangements. So, I'll wrap up this kind of design challenges, and I'll also open it up here for questions. If you've got questions, kind of go ahead and put them in the Q&A to kind of break up the time for you. But some reflections to think about is for you to think about what opportunities and challenges do you see in terms of the workflow in your group because of these different work arrangements or people working hybrid and remote. Have you seen or looked for changes in redistribution of work? And so now that maybe your organization has gone through kind of a transition to hybrid work arrangements, is there a redistribution of work that's occurred, and do you need to kind of think about that? And then finally, how did you or how will you ensure those fairness in the work arrangements? Again, procedural fairness, informational interaction or interpersonal, just as important as kind of the distributive fairness as well. Okay, so, and I see some things in the chat, and I'll let Ashley decide if we want to.
Yeah, so we have it's a kind of a long question, but Valerie was asking, I think on the previous research, did the research address the impact of remote work on disabled people? And then she goes on to say, I'm a disabled person, and remote work has allowed me to safely have a fulfilling career without worrying about endangering my health or myself. And she notes that disabled folks tend to get overlooked when this topic comes up, but it's a very reasonable accommodation.
Absolutely. I can't, off the top of my head, I do not know of any research. And the article that I was looking at that summarized the research, I don't remember anything about kind of the impact on disabled, but you can certainly see how it is a really good accommodation and something that, again, organizations, when you think about diversity of knowledge, skills, and abilities, not only can you pick up people from around the world, but you can also pick up people who may have challenges coming into the office, right? And so I think that's a really great point, Valerie, in terms of that. As a
oh, I'm
potential.
sorry, Jennifer,
Yeah.
I didn't
Go
mean
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So then Anshul, I'm sorry if I just butchered your name. The proverbial water cooler is a great metaphor for the institutional history, experience, client relationships, and context that gets passed on kind of in a more organic way. He's saying, I'm curious if the pendulum will swing back at some point. And I'm also curious about the implications for a mostly remote workforce. on upskilling, reskilling, and larger issues of the global workforce?
I think it's a really great point. I think what does the pendulum swing back? There's a lot of people that are predicting that it will. I think especially if the economy changes, then some of the power is gonna, whether you see it as fortunate or unfortunate, I guess it depends on kind of your position, is going to swing back to the organizations, right? And so I think it could swing back. I think that's what a lot of CEOs are wanting to see because of that collaboration and that creativity that they feel like is missing. I also think the culture aspect, which we'll talk about, is a piece that people are really struggling with. And so I do think that that's a case. In terms of the upskilling, reskilling, again, I think that's one of the things that is incumbent, and I think that remote workers and hybrid workers really need to think about is, are they getting the training and the upskilling that they desire? And they may have to be more proactive in that. There's a lot of predictions out there as well around the promotion of remote workers, and are they going to be given the same opportunities, which is a reasonable concern, right? The out of sight, out of mind, and that's not necessarily, again, fair. But I think that basically puts the onus on the hybrid worker or the remote worker to make sure that they are being proactive in terms of the opportunities that they want, both in terms of promotion as well as kind of upskilling.
And then I want to be cognizant of time, Jennifer, and we have a
Yeah.
lot of questions
Yay.
rolling in. So I thought perhaps I'd give you one more, and then we can try to swing back and address as many of these during the Q&A as possible.
Yeah.
Does that sound good?
Yeah.
All right. So Scott asks, how does age and or experience level of individuals flow through this general topic, early in career versus mid or late?
So there's not a lot of research around kind of age, experience that I know of, but I do think what we do know, and what you saw at the beginning that I talked about, is that for virtual teams, it's really important that they meet face to face, especially early in the beginning of the team. I would say the same thing applies earlier in the career, right? Or when someone joins an organization, is how do you socialize them into the organization? And that's really impactful. And so it's probably based more on kind of their experience within the organization than it is based on their age. So if you move to a new organization, how are you going to be socialized into that organization? Really important to do that early on in, with someone, rather than waiting longer term, or that, again, kind of that socialization, those orientations are really important. Connecting them to the right people when they first start a job is going to be key to, again, integrating people within to the team. So, all right, so I'm going to move on, and then hopefully we'll get to the other questions. So the other thing that I want to talk about is kind of coaching the team. And so there's some consistent features, again, always important in a team to establish psychological safety, which means, do team members feel comfortable raising their issues, voicing concerns, voicing ideas? Do I feel like I'm in a safe environment where I can do so? And the research would show that psychological safety has a lot of really positive impacts on teams in terms of performance, in terms of creativity, in terms of learning, all of those type of things. So important to continue to establish that within any team that you're working with. The other advantage that I talked about earlier is, again, remote hybrid teams can be really good at idea generation and problem solving. And so take advantage of that. And then, the challenges, again, three key things I think here are: can we form a team identity? How do we form that? What are some of the rules of engagement and collaboration across the technology? And then finally, the professional isolation. And so in terms of forming a team identity, we talk a lot about culture of teams. And I think team identity is another way to think about kind of developing this connection with other people, in terms of thinking about, am I a member of this team? And so when you think about identity, if I were to ask you to complete the statement, I am, or I am that would really kind of formulate for you what your identity is held in. And so it might be, I'm a spouse, I'm a mom, I'm a dad. It could be, different roles, different organizations that you're a part of. Obviously, we hope that all of you say I'm a Hawkeye, right? In terms of being core to your identity. And so the same thing applies to teams is what are some labels? And again, maybe labels isn't the best term because I know we don't like to label people, but what are some descriptors that might apply to your team? So do we want to be known as a team that's really dynamic? Do we want to be known as a team that's very warm, collaborative? We want to be known as being a competent team. We want to be known as an inclusive team. And so I think this is an exercise that you can do within your team. And again, going back to Scott's questions about kind of experience and things like that, always important to kind of revisit these things, right? Especially if you've got team members that are changing or you're trying to integrate new team members so that they know kind of this is who we are as a team. And so think about the most important descriptor by which you would like your team to be known, and think about what you want other team people with that your team interacts with. Is it your clients? Is it other organizations, other teams? How do you want them to describe your team? And I think going through this exercise with your team, to have them individually think about this is kind of how I want this team to be known. And then can we consolidate that to maybe 5 descriptors that would really say this is who we are as a team, and these are the kind of the things that we want to abide by, is a really important piece of that, developing that team identity. The other key piece, obviously, in a remote and hybrid environment is the rules of engagement and the collaboration across the technology. So again, really important to establish that rapport and relationships early in a team. Some of that, I think one of the questions or one of the things that I saw in the chat was about those water cooler moments. There's different technologies. I know people or supervisors that keep Microsoft Teams open all day, or there's also a Gather app where people can just drop in. Maybe some people do it via Zoom, where people can always just drop into your personal meeting room to chat with you. Obviously, there's instant messaging and things like that, but how do we get those water cooler moments? But it's important to think about, and how do we establish those relationships? The other is there are different etiquette or netiquette that we need to establish in terms of Zoom or Microsoft Teams, and a regular cadence of communication. So people know, again, we're all distributed, we're working different work arrangements, but we know we've got one-on-ones at this point, we've got town halls. What are the kind of that regular cadence of communication that we can establish? And then, the other thing that has often come to me from different supervisors is they feel like there's less engagement online. When I have a Zoom meeting, people have their cameras off, people aren't as engaged. And so, one of the pieces of advice that I would give is maybe delegate a meeting agenda or new ideas to team members prior to the meeting, so that they know I'm responsible for this, or I've got to lead kind of the meeting, and kind of get the group's involvement in different ways. Or I'm going to ask, I want a specific idea from you about this issue that we're facing, so that you really are kind of preparing them for that engagement in the meetings. And then the last thing I want to talk about is professional isolation. Again, if you go back to the research, remote hybrid workers have really a lot of high job satisfaction, but they can face professional isolation. And so when you think about some basic psychological needs that employees have, that individuals have, it really comes down to kind of 3 things. They want autonomy in their work, in terms of, can I decide kind of how I go about things, or do I have autonomy in decisions sometimes, or in my work methods? Do I feel competent, right? Am I getting the training that I need? Do I feel like I know what I'm doing within my job? And then people also have, this basic psychological need of relatedness. And, I think remote and hybrid work really a lot of times can fulfill that autonomy, especially could potentially fulfill competence. But the relatedness is a piece that I think we really have to pay attention to. And just in our own research here, one of the things that one of the I guess segments of work arrangements that I'm more concerned about is the hybrid worker, because I almost think it's the loneliest of all of them, because they're often pulled between this kind of independent work, right? When they're working remotely, and basically the research would show that when you're working remotely, you tend to be kind of more independent in your work. And then I come to work and I got to be interdependent. And yet, if I think about my own experience, there are days when I come into the office and maybe there's someone that I really wanted to see and they're not around, right? And it's like, well, then I think, well, why did I even come into the office, right? And you can understand how a hybrid worker feels that way, and or a hybrid worker that comes in and basically spends their day in the office on a Zoom meeting. And so they're thinking, why did I come into the office, right? I could have done all these meetings remotely. And so I do think hybrid workers, especially, there's a lot that's the future of work, is this hybrid option, but I really think we need to think about that. Alternatively, in terms of what are we doing in terms of days in the office? Are we using that meaningfully to collaborate with others? Now, the other thing that I will also say is that a supervisor brought up to me the other day is that, a lot of teams basically solve this issue by bringing everyone in on the same day. Every Wednesday we're together when we really reserve that time as a team for kind of our collaboration, which is good. But obviously, there's some challenges to that. One is, do you have the space to be able to do that? Because part of the whole move to remote and hybrid work is that we're also reducing office space. But the other thing that the supervisor pointed out to me was that she was like, it's also crazy and everybody's talking and I feel like we don't get any work done because it's their only time to get together. And so I do think you got to set limits, right, on that time of, okay, we're going to take the first 30 minutes, right, to get coffee together and to kind of catch up on the last week or whatever it is, and then we're going to get down to work in terms of collaborating with each other. And so I think that that's a fair point, is that when you bring everybody into the office, then it can be really disruptive as well. We do, from our own research here, again, what we have found is that the hybrid worker, when they come into the office, they do feel like they're interrupted a lot more than when they're working remotely. One of the clear benefits of hybrid work is that people can take the time when they're working remotely to get stuff done that is independent work, and then they can come into the office. But it also provides a lot of challenges as well. So just some things to think about in terms of kind of that professional isolation. And so again, as a reflection, what are some of those coaching challenges that you need to manage? Think about, how are you building a team identity or a culture? I think that's probably the thing that most organizations are struggling with, is how do we continue to maintain a culture when everybody is remote or they're hybrid? What rules of engagement have you established or do you need to establish? One of the things that I see from Kate is, how do we get people who absolutely refuse to turn on their cameras in Zoom meetings? In the past, there have been organizations that have mandated that cameras need to be on. I will say there is research that shows there's Zoom fatigue, and that turning off your camera reduces that. And so again, I do think, to your question, Kate, I think you've got to balance between how important is it that the camera be on, or do we need to engage in this, versus can the camera be off? Because if people are sitting in every Zoom meetings a lot, having the camera on can be more exhausting. And so I think it's just one of those trade-offs that you have to think about, what's more important. And when are there times when people's cameras really need to be on? But I can totally understand when I teach a class. That's one of the things that I think is tough about webinars, is I can't see your faces. And so I do feel the pain of how do you establish kind of those rules of engagement. And then finally, how are you maximizing time spent face-to-face? So if you've got hybrid workers, are you finding times, maybe it's not on a weekly basis, maybe it's on a monthly or a quarterly basis, where you can bring everybody in and work together and collaborate together? And how can we use that time in a meaningful way when people are face-to-face or are coming into the office? So I will take questions now. Surprisingly, I did get through all of that. I know I kind of went quickly through that last piece, but I want to make sure that there's questions. So, Ashley?
Yep, absolutely. So Andrew has a question for us. How do we address the apprehension from those who remain in office about their challenges with their colleagues being remote?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by apprehension. But I think it comes down to, again, is, some of that apprehension may come from a variety of things. I think one of them may be, do I feel like, again, if you go back to the perceptions of fairness, do I feel like everybody got the same opportunity? The procedures were fair in terms of filing or requesting alternative work arrangements? Is there a fit with their role and things like that? But then I also think if the apprehension is about, well, I'm fine that they have these remote work arrangements, but I don't know how to get a hold of them, or I'm concerned about this workflow, is again, have them think through and sit down as a team of who's interdependent on who. I think sometimes we often don't realize, again, the example I gave of ExxonMobil, I'm not sure that the expense analyst understood that how much I was depending on him to get my work done. And so having just an honest conversation between team members around kind of where do I need information and work? How can I get a hold of you? And make sure that, again, if you go back to that trust issue, candid and very timely responses are really important in terms of building trust between team members. And so I think going back and thinking about those principles with the team is helpful.
Um, and I'm sorry, I had a really good follow-up to that, but it was in the chat. And it was talking about executives and kind of changing that old school mind of everybody in the building and how to get higher ups who might be used to that in-person work more comfortable with the hybrid. Um, so I'm sorry, I can't find the question.
No, that's fine.
In the chat, I saw it
Yeah.
and then it disappeared.
I do think that that's, you saw that in the CEO quotes. And so there certainly are a lot of managers, both young and those very much experienced, that are concerned about kind of the collaboration. And so, everything that I continue to go back to is, the research would show that the productivity is still there. And not only are you getting the same level of productivity, but you also are having less intent to turn over, which should be important to those managers as well. And so if we can get the technologies in place and again, help manage relationships between team members, I think it can be just as effective. And so I think it's a reminder of those type of things to different managers. But certainly, I think the biggest thing that I continue to see from managers or when you hear about CEOs is they're worried about the creativity and the innovation of the organization. There's not a lot of research on that. And so I do think, that probably continues to be a concern. And so thinking about ways that we can continue to be innovative is probably the piece that they may be concerned about the most.
Yeah. This question comes from an anonymous attendee. One thing that has been a challenge for our hybrid team is that we always want a staff member in the office from each team, but sometimes there are illnesses, vacations, other things that keep people away, and it's been a challenge to manage. Any advice?
Yeah, I think one of the things to think about is kind of cross training or backing up between those different staff members, even though if they're from different offices. We have I've seen examples where we have different people that support a lot of different groups, and so one of them may be out at one day versus another day, and so if there's a lot of cross training and people can back up the other, then that's helpful to manage those type of situations.
So another good question, and I think you said there's not a lot of research on it yet, but is there research on how much a supervisor should reach out to team members? Is daily enough, or should a supervisor proactively reach out between meetings, um, especially if those team members might be a bit more introverted?
Yeah, so I think there's two sides to that to think about. I think it's Michael's question. I think there's two things to think about, Michael. One is there are remote workers that have been in my classes as MBA students that would say they feel like their supervisor is what they would call as a dot watcher, because they're watching that little dot on either Skype or Zoom to see whether it's green or red. And so they're, it's some sort of indication to them that they're working. And so I think checking in with them on a daily basis is could come across as kind of micromanaging. On the flip side of that, I think it's important that if you do establish one-on-ones, that you don't cancel them, because that, obviously gives the feeling that they're not really that helpful to have one-on-ones, or that you're not willing to take the time. And so I think if you establish something, to be consistent with it is important. And so I would establish something consistently, and you decide what cadence works best. I don't know that it has to be daily. It depends on kind of what type of work you do. But more importantly, I think it's important that they know how to reach out to you, right? And that they are clear. We often talk about an open door policy, but how can they get a hold of you? And are you willing? Are you available? And maybe it's setting aside time, especially if you're managing a lot of different remote workers, kind of like office hours, where you're saying, I'm available at this time each day for people to pop in and ask me questions and things like that. I have other meetings during the day, so I may not be available, but during this time, I'll set aside that as a time when people can pop in and talk to me as well. And so that might be a few ideas of how to handle that.
I'm popping back over to the chat because there were some good questions in there when we took that question break earlier. So Rosie asked, for positions that are public facing, like student service offices, have you come across any data on the effects of hybrid or remote work on customer service?
What we have found, at least here at the university, is that I think customer service has actually been higher because there's more availability. So because we can offer um, hybrid, or we can offer virtual options in terms of office hours or advising appointments. And so again, you can think about it as customer service appointments. With the student being our customer, we've actually found much higher satisfaction. So I think it's just, again, it also may be that you can expand kind of the time frame, right? So our people that are working remotely, maybe they start their day earlier and finish earlier, or you can allow that flex time that also gives then your customers more flexibility in terms of being able to reach people. So again, not a lot of research on that, but I will say anecdotally that we have found kind of higher customer service.
Bill asks, any recommendations for bringing in new staff to a group that is remote and hybrid, acclimation to a company and to the team culture, especially?
Yeah, I mean, the best obviously is to have kind of this face-to-face retreat, or group meeting or things like that. In the absence of that, I think it's really important that rather than having a group kind of Zoom session where you introduce everyone, that they meet with them one-on-one. And so my husband actually has had the experience of coming into an organization remotely. And so the key people that he needed to interact with, not just on his team, but also outside of his team, the organization was very good about setting up one-on-one appointments to really integrate him as a new member into that. And so those would be some of the suggestions that I would give. And if they are, geographically located, maybe there's something fun that you can do as a group. That obviously gets a little bit burdensome if you've continued to have new members, but I would say setting up one-on-ones would also be helpful.
Going back to the topic of isolation, what research have you seen on the impact of that and the mental health of the employees who are working from home?
Well, again, if you think about that basic psychological need of relatedness, um, and it obviously is an individual difference. If you're more introverted, you may not need as much interaction as others, but everybody has a basic psychological need of relatedness. So if they're not getting that from work, hopefully they have other outlets in order to do that. But the research would basically show that, again, that job satisfaction increases in terms of the amount of remoteness that you have. But then it levels off, and it levels off because of that. So it doesn't continue to climb, but it levels off because of that professional isolation. And so I do think it's important that people still feel connected. And I think it's just checking in with those remote workers to say, how are you feeling about your connectedness within the organization, with the other members of your group? How can we help facilitate that? Because again, there is some individual differences. They may be getting their basic psychological need for relatedness fulfilled through a social organization, through their family, those type of things, and may not need it from their members at work. But if they aren't, it's important to kind of get that to them.
I like this question in the chat. Millennials appear to be looking for even more flexibility than is possible with remote work. Reduced work hours, reduced work week, etc. Is the 4-day week where we are headed in the next 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've been trying to do kind of the 40 or the 410s for a long time. No, I don't think it's a bad idea in terms of I just came back from overseas, and obviously they don't work as many hours as we do in the US. And so there's a balance there between productivity and well-being. I don't necessarily have any good answers in terms of how to handle the millennial generation or those that want to reduce different work hours. I think some of that's going to shift over time, but we'll see.
Is that heavily millennial, or are we seeing that also more from Gen Z?
Well, I mean, I think we always try to think about different generations. This generation seems to be this, and yet there's a lot of similarities across generations as well. And so, there's a lot of people, I think, what am I, Gen X, that would say they want to work less too. So I try not to categorize it by generations.
This is from an anonymous person. Should hybrid remote work be a part of a reward benefit for employers who are getting good performance reviews? I think they mean employees who are getting good performance reviews. My apologies.
I think it certainly can be, and that's part of the reason why people think that the productivity is the same among remote workers, because we only give it to those that we know can work productively. I think the danger in that is offering it as a reward, is that, again, the fairness of you're essentially being very clear that this, and maybe you want to do that, but that this person is being rewarded based on their performance rather than their job type can be working remotely. So again, if there's what we found is that a good fit within the job with the work arrangement is important. And so that would say that if everybody has if it's the same type of job, that everybody should have that opportunity to work remotely. If you want to use it as reward, you're clearly saying to the others that there's a difference in distributive justice. And again, as long as that's what the norm that you want to put out there, that we're going to reward people with remote work based on their performance, I think that's okay. But just be very clear that that's what it's based on.
And I'm going to kick you this last question, just being cognizant of time. Many organizations have more than one office location, so team members are in different locations, whether or not they are actually in an office together. What do you see as the difference between this and working from home?
Well, honestly, there's probably not, right? Much of a difference. I mean, we've been doing remote teams for a long time where people have been across the world in different things. I think one of the things that that managers would say is the difference is they feel like people are going to get interrupted at home or they're doing other things when they're at home. Our research would show that they're not getting interrupted more, even from family when they're working from home, and that they're actually able to do more independent work. And so I think that's one of the differences is when they're in a different location within the organization working on a team versus working from home, they may not be able to do that independent work. So those would be the differences that I would see. The last thing, so I know Ashley's going to wrap me up. So I do want to say, you know, here at Tippie, we've got the Tippie Leadership Collaborative. If you want different developmental experiences, we have a host of different people who do kind of these types of sessions. I'm just one of many who do these sessions on hybrid or remote work. And so visit the website, reach out if those are things that you're interested in. And then finally, reach out to me if you have questions. I know there are a host of questions in the chat and in the Q&A that we probably didn't get to. I would, especially if you're wanting, I will say, you know, I am not only interested in kind of talking to organizations, but also researching these things and finding out what works for your organization. And so if those are anything that is of interest to you, please feel free to reach out. So thank you so
Awesome.
much for your time.
Yes, and thank you everybody for all your chatter in the chat box. There are some really good recommendations in there, books to read. I just thank you everybody for your participation today. And also thank you, Jennifer, for your wonderful presentation on working apart, but together, how to design and coach hybrid teams for peak performance. When our webinar ends in just a moment, you'll see a quick survey, and we'd be grateful if you could share your thoughts and help us make future virtual events even better. My goodness, I'm having a hard time reading today. On behalf of the Tippie College of Business, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And as always, go Hawks.